Hello and welcome to the podcast series CAREWELL Conversations, raising awareness about the issues and challenges facing family carers who combine work and care. By engaging with employers, HR professionals, employee representative organisations, family carers and the research community. My name is Brian Doyle. I'm the podcast series producer and a researcher with the CAREWELL project, a collaboration between University College Dublin and Family Carers Ireland, funded by the Health Research Board. The overall aim of the CAREWELL Research Project is to promote health and self-care among working family carers. And over the course of this podcast series, we will have conversations with those who have a role to play in supporting working family carers and begin to tease out the challenges and issues facing them and their employers.
Hello, I'm Dr. Nikki Dunne. I'm the Research Officer here with Family Carers Ireland, and I'm joined here today on the CAREWELL Conversations podcast with Stecy Yghemonos, the Executive Director of Eurocarers. Welcome, Stecy.
Thank you. Hi, Nikki. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation in the podcast series. So thanks a lot for your invitation.
So, Stecy, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about the work of Eurocarers and how you became involved in that work as well.
Sure. So Eurocarers is an umbrella organization. We are a European network. We are based in Brussels, but we have member organizations across Europe. The network currently brings together 75 organizations from 26 countries, and these organizations are either carers organizations, such as Family Carers Ireland. So they provide direct services to family carers. We call them informal carers at European level, by the way. So information, training, respite care, they do advocacy work. And let's say roughly the other half of our member organizations is composed of research institutes and universities. So this means that we are able to collect and generate data about the situation and needs of family carers across Europe, and also to define policy recommendations. So to put it simply, our job really is to be the voice of family carers at European level and to ensure all policy developments of relevance to their daily life takes them into consideration. And I got involved in the topic because I actually used to work in the field of, first human rights and then health, and more specifically, health inequalities and the social determinants of health. So how your socio-economic background shapes your health outcomes. And so prevention, cure, care, ultimately they're all part of the same journey. So it was only natural for me to, at some point, explore the topic of informal care. And so I suppose, just like it is the case for a majority of family carers across Europe, I only realized after I joined Eurocarers that I had also experienced what being a carer means at personal level with my mom and then with my dad.
Stecy, I have a similar experience to yourself in the sense that I didn't realize I had experience of a caring role for my grandmother as well until I joined Family Carers Ireland. So there's a lot of unidentified carers across Europe. That's really interesting, though, the journey into your current role, and there's a lot of interest, I guess, in caring as a social determinant of health. In terms of the focus of the CAREWELL project on this podcast series, we're explicitly focusing on working family carers, so carers who are balancing paid employment with the caring role. Can you say something about this group, about what we know about this group across Europe, about common issues or challenges and developments across member states?
Yes. Well, although we could do it probably with more data and more nuanced data about carers in Europe and working carers, I think we know more than enough to act. We know, for example, that the lion's share of all care in Europe is actually provided by family carers and by women in particular. And this with, generally speaking, with extremely limited recognition and support. We also know that the value of family carers' contribution to our care systems is huge. It is actually so significant that it is virtually impossible to replace by professional care. Just to give you an idea, when it comes to Ireland, if the Irish government decided to try and replace family carers by care professionals, it would have to more than double the budget currently devoted to formal long-term care. And then finally, we also know that caregiving does not come without a cost for family carers themselves. Without proper support, they face difficulties in accessing education, employment, balancing caregiving and professional responsibilities. They face all sorts of negative health outcomes. As you said, it is a social determinant of health, so physical and mental health. So this is just for the context, to the discussion on working carers. So we are really dealing with a vicious circle. On the positive side, in the last few years, a growing number of member states have started to pay attention to family carers and to working carers. And the main reason for that is, of course, that many decision makers have now realized that it will be extremely difficult to address the challenges generated by demographic aging. So the growing prevalence of chronic diseases, the growing demand for care, the long-term sustainability and the quality of our care systems without supporting and recognizing somehow the contribution of family carers. So the burning question for our movement, or the movement we represent now, is how we convert this growing awareness into meaningful policy action for the future. And so, of course, as you can imagine, this is at the core of our work at European level.
That's really, really interesting, Stecy. And yeah, a lot of the kind of issues and challenges that you've mapped out there are hugely relevant in the Irish context. So I guess if we're talking about European level, but if we kind of home in a little bit on Ireland, what is Ireland's position with regard to work and family carers, compared to other European countries?
Yeah, I would say that generally speaking, Ireland is probably one of the most advanced countries in Europe when it comes to policy measures targeted at family carers and at working carers. This is because the Irish care system is very familialistic. It is rooted in the idea that it ultimately belongs to families to take responsibility for the care of their members. So, for example, working carers in Ireland have access to a carer's leave, which is pretty good compared to other countries, but the leave is unpaid and it only constitutes a right provided that the carer meets some eligibility criteria. So, for example, the beneficiary must have been continuously employed by the employer for at least 1 year. For short-term leaves, the employer is legally entitled to refuse a request, and the leave cannot be taken on a part-time basis. So, the system can probably be improved still. Having said that, as I said, Ireland is pretty advanced compared to other countries. And in addition to the leave, the beneficiary may also be eligible for carer's benefit or carer's allowance, again, provided that they have sufficient social insurance contributions and meet some eligibility criteria. And those who receive the care benefit or the care allowance can also build up credits for social insurance contributions or pension. So very clearly, the Irish approach is extremely comprehensive and certainly way more comprehensive and mature than what we see in other countries. So, quite frankly, from our perspective, the Irish model is often used as a good example of what should be put in place across Europe.
Yeah, it is interesting, because obviously we focus in on so many of the issues, but we're also well aware yet that Ireland is well to the fore in Europe when it comes to statutory leave for carers and so on. I guess maybe moving on to one of the really important pieces of legislation that's on the horizon at the moment for work and family carers, the EU Directive for Work-Life Balance for parents and carers. Can you maybe say a little bit about what this is and how it came about? Like, were Eurocarers involved in pushing for this piece of legislation?
Yes. So the Work-Life Balance Directive was first proposed by the European Commission in 2017, and it forms part of a broader package of policy initiatives called the EU Pillar of Social Rights, which is essentially a set of 20 principles for a fair and social Europe that have been reaffirmed by the Commission and then endorsed by the European Parliament and member states, after 2017. And essentially, the objective of the Commission with the pillar, quite frankly, was to try and bring back the social perspective at EU level following the economic crisis of 2008. The aim of the Work-Life Balance Directive is to improve families' access to family leave and flexible work arrangements. When it was first introduced or announced, it focused only on the introduction of paternity and parental leave across Europe. But Eurocarers got involved along with a long list of NGOs, and we spent almost 3 years on the directive to ensure that the directive would also include a carer's leave. And I'm very glad to say that our efforts paid off ultimately. The directive was indeed approved in 2019, and it includes a right to an unpaid annual carer's leave of at least 5 days per year, as well as access to flexible working arrangements for family carers. Now, the directive has to be transposed by all member states by August 2022, so it's still work in progress. As you can see, it will not change drastically the situation for family carers in Ireland, since existing leaves already go beyond the measures defined in the directive. But we have always approached the directive as one element in a larger pool of, let's say, care-friendly policies. And so we are actively working with EU institutions and civil society organizations on additional measures building on the directive, which we hope will also have a positive impact in Ireland. As for the rest of Europe, the directive is a significant breakthrough for our movement, because it introduces the legal concept of informal carer, which is still non-existent in many countries. And it also means that carers will be encouraged to step forward and to identify themselves as family carers.
That's really interesting, Stecy. And I know we will be returning to this topic probably multiple times over the course of the podcast series. But it is quite interesting when you think about the statutory leave, like let's say in the Irish context, that we do have, carers leave, but those kind of 5 days can really act as a precursor to carers leave for, those who don't necessarily need or want longer blocks of leave from their employment. So I know for our State of Caring survey last year, I think there was 16% of carers who used annual leave to care. So those 5 days can potentially, just act as that stopgap rather than somebody having to take 12 weeks of carers leave. So it's a really important initiative, even for the likes of Ireland, who's already doing quite well in terms of carers leave, for the statutory right to it. So what do you think it's going to mean in practice, though, for working carers across Ireland and Europe, indeed?
Well, first of all, the implementation of the directive by member states is compulsory. So, we do not foresee any major challenge when it comes to its implementation. But as we just discussed, the rights defined in the directive are fairly limited. And this is why I insisted on the words "at least" in the sentence, at least 5 days of leave earlier. So the Commission itself strongly encourages member states to go beyond the 5 days and to introduce payment or allowance to guarantee effective take-up of the right, and especially by men, for example. So it is also our role as civil society organizations to support that process and to put pressure on our decision makers at national and regional level. I think it is also important to establish a dialogue with employers and trade unions who need to understand that the leave and the introduction of flexible working arrangements for carers is actually not a barrier to productivity, quite the opposite. Research shows that human resources policies supporting working carers actually impact positively on staff retention, on absenteeism, on performance, on well-being, etc. So it is really the directive, even if it looks, extremely limited in its scope and in its ambition when it comes to family carers. What we're seeing in practice is that it's really generating a change of attitude and a larger movement around caring in Europe. So we're really trying to build on the directive to discuss other aspects of what it actually means to be a family carer on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then what kind of, what do you think the impact is likely to be, when the act is actually transposed? What will it mean for family carers who are balancing paid employment with their caring role?
Well, first of all, as I indicated before, besides the access to the leave and to flexible working arrangements, it actually means that as part of the transposition, the legal concept of what informal care is and who informal carers are also needs to appear somehow now in the national legislation. Now, it is already the case in Ireland, but when you look at the whole of Europe, it's far from being clear in other national legislation. So again, I think it's going to have a big impact on our movement and on carers, hopefully in the next few years, and hopefully it will make a real difference in people's life. And with COVID and the impact of COVID, and I guess we'll discuss that later on in our conversation. It's become and it's apparent that not only do we need to act upon caring in Europe, but it is also very urgent to put measures in place to strengthen our formal care systems, but also to support family carers who play an essential role in the provision of care and will continue to do so, at least in the foreseeable future. So it's really a continuous, let's say, process, which has been boosted by the approval of the directive.
Stecy, you mentioned, that you have suggested, the wording of at least, and the suggestion, or you've mentioned that it's in the directive, it's not, there isn't a statutory entitlement to paid for the 5 days to be paid. Is that something, I'm just trying to think of like what the challenges or the obstacles might be to the implementation of the legislation.
Yeah, well, look, when it comes to policies targeted at family carers in Europe, it should be said that access to a carer's leave, paid or unpaid, as well as access to flexible work arrangements, are among the most common forms of support to carers we see across Europe. Now, quite frankly, payment is either rare, so access to a paid care leave, or it is extremely symbolic. So the amount, the compensation is extremely limited. So I think the concern on the side of policymakers that we often come across is that they fear that people will leave their job, their paid job, to become family carers, because obviously it's so comfortable to stay at home and take care of your family members and get payment for that. So we need to change the mindset around that assumption and demonstrate that actually it's much more than symbolically supporting carers. It's about recognizing again the central role they play in the provision of care. And also the fact that without them, our care systems would collapse. One of the key challenges we faced when, let's say, in our battle to convince institutions and member states that the directive should also include a right to a carer's leave, is who's going to pay. who's going to pay for that leave? And particularly employers were, at first at least, very reluctant to support the idea of a leave. And then new studies emerged showing that it's a real win-win. And it's actually an investment because, as I said before, in terms of productivity, reduced absenteeism, loyalty, staff retention, it really pays off. So we also see a growing list of big companies putting in place measures to support their employees with caregiving responsibilities. Because again, they see the benefits, for the company and their staff.
Yeah, Family Carers Ireland, we actually have our own kind of initiative to help companies support working family carers, the Care and Employers program. So I know the UK does something similar with that as well. So, okay, so just I guess we will be kind of. Like I said earlier, we'll be returning to the topic of the directive kind of over the course of the podcast series. So we might move on from that now. But if we were to think about, because you obviously have the kind of the view of what's going on across member states, have you come across any kind of innovative practices or policies that support working family carers in the European context?
Yeah, in terms of policies, as I said, it's essentially, very similar to what you would find in Ireland. So carers leave, flexible work arrangements to some extent, essentially unpaid care leaves, even though some countries are pretty generous. I'm thinking about, for example, Austria, Belgium, Denmark, but also, for example, Bulgaria and Latvia. But in the majority of countries, access to a carer's leave is usually unpaid. Paradoxically, though, what we see is very innovative practices put in place on a voluntary basis by companies themselves. And that's, I think, the very interesting aspect of the discussion. So we see more and more employers and trade unions proactively take initiatives on the topic. The main reason is the business case that I mentioned before, the benefits. So for example, we see employers teaming up with civil society organizations. That's the case, and I think that's what you were referring to, Nikki, in the UK with Employers for Carers, which is a big initiative and very successful initiative, which aims to provide guidance and consultancy services to companies about how they can adapt their HR policies to address the needs of employees with caregiving responsibilities. So we also see various schemes to promote good human resources practices in support for working carers, including, for example, in Scotland, the Carer Positive initiative with more than, I think, 200 organizations involved and thousands of staff, also being part of the initiative. Some companies take action to minimize the financial disadvantages of unpaid care by, for example, paying their employees emergency leaves, by minimizing the income loss associated with working time reduction, or by providing additional paid leaves. Other companies provide care-related support. They organize information sessions. They provide counseling. They promote positive attitudes, among their staff members, or they organize sessions about carers' health and well-being. So we see all sorts of innovative measures and practices emerging across Europe, and we're also trying, of course, as you can imagine, to keep track of those and centralize information to be able to disseminate and hopefully replicate elsewhere. So yeah, it's really a booming, let's say, environment.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads to learn there, obviously, and having some sort of central repository, like you said, where you're able to kind of see what's going on in other countries is fantastic. Just actually, I guess what you've sketched out there is very much for carers who are working in maybe bigger companies or organizations. I'm wondering if there's anything there, and maybe there isn't, for like people that are self-employed, or carers who might be on more precarious contracts. Is that something that you've seen across Europe?
Yes, well, that's much more difficult, I have to admit. First of all, because we don't have much data about that. There's not a lot of research about SMEs and how they deal with workers or employees with caregiving responsibilities. Having said that, intuitively, I'd say, or at least based on the few research, studies and so on at our disposal, it seems that obviously smaller companies are usually much more flexible in the way they can adapt to the specific needs of their employees. But we certainly need more data on the topic and on practices. On practices in place. But I think the interesting question you're raising is that at policy level, the entry point when addressing or trying to address the needs of carers is always in terms of informal care or caregiving as a barrier to employment or full-time employment. And we're also trying to change that narrative, because obviously, first of all, that means it's a very narrow focused approach. We cannot only focus on those carers across Europe who are employed. Obviously, there are many carers who are not employed or are self-employed, and they're not on the radar screen of policymakers. And yet these people also need to be supported. They should also have access to rights. So that's why directive is only one piece in a bigger puzzle. We need to use the directive as and the momentum around the directive to continue the now initiated dialogue with policymakers around the need to support carers. But we of course need to go way beyond the scope of directive to have a universal and an equitable approach to the questions associated to family caregiving. So I think the key learning with the directive is, even though it is a policy initiative, I think the fascinating aspect with the directive is that it was fairly limited in its scope when you look at it more in detail, at least from the perspective of family carers. And yet it's really generating a change of attitudes among many relevant actors who suddenly are trying to adapt and develop their own initiatives proactively and on a voluntary basis. And I think that's a lesson to be retained for the future. We don't necessarily need, very elaborate policy developments to actually make a real difference in the life of carers. That's the situation we have to deal with at the moment.
I think that's really interesting, Stecy, because I think, like you're saying, just generating that conversation is such a good starting point, where, especially in countries or organizations where there isn't any kind of supports for carers there. So having that kind of conversation started amongst relevant actors is so important. But also for any researchers listening to the podcast, I think it's what we've identified there is an important research gap where, there is kind of more evidence needed around, those self-employed or on more precarious contracts as well, to kind of fit into, the bigger puzzle, to kind of add another piece there, or some more understanding around those carers. Just to move on then to where we're at now in Europe with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. how has COVID-19 impacted working carers in the European context?
Between November 2020 and March 2021, we conducted an EU-wide survey on the topic and on the, on the topic of the impact of COVID on carers, and we focused on different aspects, including access to work and the impact on employment. And according to our study, a majority of carers have seen their employment status impacted by the pandemic. The negative impact is pretty clear. About 20% of respondents say that they had to reduce their working time as a result of the pandemic because they were not able to reconcile work and care anymore. 10% say that or said that they were unable to work as a result of the pandemic, and 5% lost their job as a result of the pandemic. So a very clear impact among carers. Now, I should have said at the very beginning, and I'm going to insist on that now, that the gender dimension of all the challenges I mentioned earlier and the gender dimension of the impact I just mentioned, the impact of the pandemic, is extremely clear. So women have been more affected than men by the pandemic, but generally speaking, when it comes to caregiving, women tend to be more affected in terms of the negative impact. On the positive side, about 45% of working carers, at least in our study, they were not impacted by the pandemic, and many of those who were impacted actually benefited from support measures. And the most common measures in terms of work-life balance include flexible working arrangements, flexible working hours. So flexible work arrangements being telework, for example, flexible working hours, and access to paid or unpaid leaves. Unfortunately, as we discussed before, these are not universally accessible, or they may be very limited in their impact. And so as a result, many carers have not been able to reconcile paid work and caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic. And I should add that about 20% of carers have seen their income decrease as a consequence of the COVID-19 outbreak, which also means an impact on poverty, and something to keep an eye on for the future, of course.
Thanks very much, Stecy, and that's a really excellent report that you published earlier in the year on the impact of COVID-19 on carers across member states. If we just move on to thinking about the future, and you've kind of alluded to some of the kind of policy, the new policy initiatives coming down the line, but what else, apart from the directive, is in store for carers and working family carers at EU level in the future?
I would say that there are many things and many positive things in store for carers in the future, and in the months to come, so in the near future. In the last 2 years only, the number of EU and national policy developments that make explicit reference to carers and the need to support them, and working carers in particular, has grown exponentially. As I indicated, the transposition of the Work-Life Balance Directive at national level is still work in progress. So it's being discussed by national parliaments and governments. So again, this battle is not over. We still have a chance to convince member states that they should go beyond the 5 days, and that the leave should be paid. And we need to continue to push, of course. In September this year, so on the 15th of September, time flies with the pandemic, the president of the European Commission announced, in very much, quite frankly, to our surprise, and it's a positive surprise, that in 2022, the Commission will put forward a proposal for an EU strategy on care, which should address both formal and informal care. Among the expected measures is the idea of providing family carers with pension credits for care-related career breaks in occupational pension schemes. So this should nicely complement the directive on work-life balance and contribute to bridge the gender pension gap as well. It should also encourage an equal sharing of care responsibilities between women and men, we think. So we're really supporting the idea. But we hope that the strategy that's proposed by the Commission will include even more measures in terms of access to information and training for carers, potentially the validation of the skills acquired by carers on the job, to allow them as well to, who knows, go back to the labor market and have those skills used on the labor market. In terms of access to respite care, so there's a lot of potential in that strategy, and at least at this stage, it looks like the Commission intends to be ambitious. Obviously, the strategy will not only focus on informal carers or family carers, it will also focus on professional care, which from our perspective, is and should remain the foundation of universal care in Europe, and is obviously an essential tool to alleviate the pressure on families and on family carers. So we hope that the strategy will also include ambitious targets in terms of investment in professional care to make sure the profession is attractive, because it is not at the moment. And as a result, we're facing huge shortages in terms of the care workforce, which also obviously has an impact on family carers. So extremely promising, let's say, environment for our work in the future. And obviously that will also have repercussions at national level, including in Ireland. So stay tuned, keep an eye on that. And as you can see, our work is far from being complete.
Thanks, Stecy. I think what you've just explained there is testament to the work of Eurocarers, and that increased awareness of the importance of carers across Europe as well, that's actually being seen by the European Commission on a European level. So it's fantastic. I'll finish up there unless there's anything that you would like to add that you feel we haven't covered today about the situation of work and family carers at European level.
No, I think we covered most of or at least the most important aspects of the current policy environment. Just allow me to say that, let's say, the progress we've managed to achieve is only possible thanks to obviously it's teamwork. And as I said in my introduction, Eurocarers is not the office in Brussels. Eurocarers is the network. So we are, of course, stronger when we speak as one voice and when we work together. And so it's also an opportunity to thank you and Family Carers Ireland for your amazing work. I must say that we use many of your practices and of your messages as an inspiration to what should be done at the EU level, but also across member states. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Stecy, and likewise, it's fantastic for us to be involved in Eurocarers and hear what's going on at European level and have the opportunity to feed into Eurocarers as well. So I'll just finish up there then, Stecy. Listen, we really appreciate you coming to talk on CAREWELL Conversations. There's a lot of food for thought that you've spoken about, and like you said, the upcoming initiatives and policy developments are really just the start of the conversations as well. So thank you, Stecy.
Thank you. And again, it was a pleasure to contribute to the podcast series. So thanks for your invitation.
We've reached the end of our CAREWELL conversation for this episode. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more from us, please subscribe to CAREWELL Conversations on your podcast platform of choice, or alternatively, you will find us at carewellproject.com or across our various social media channels, which are linked in our podcast feed. We'd also like to hear from you, our listeners. Please feel free to leave any comments, feedback or suggestions you may have on any of our social media feeds, or you can contact us directly at carewell@ucd.ie. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to you joining us on future CAREWELL conversations.